Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final session of the PIT count office hours in this round for the 2021 point in time count. My name is Tommy Joe Bednar from Apt Associates, and I'm going to go over a few pieces of logistical and housekeeping information before we get started in earnest today. First and foremost, as I am sure that many of you want to know, today's session is being recorded, and the recording of today's session, along with the slides and a copy of the chat and the Q&A, will be posted to the HUD Exchange. It'll give us about 2 to 3 business days to make those accessible and get those up for all of you. Those materials, along with materials from the past point-in-time count office hours, can be found on the HUD Exchange. That link is on your screen now. We also hope that everyone has good audio, and to ensure that you have good audio, especially if you would like to ask a question verbally towards the end of our session today, we highly encourage that you connect to the audio via phone. That phone number can be found on your screen now and is also in the chat. Again, it just yields better quality audio for both hearing and potentially asking a question over the phone. Speaking of the chat feature, we also hope that you will ask many questions, share comments, experiences of what's going on in your community, and the best way to do that throughout our webinar is to use the chat feature. While everyone is muted now, chat feature will be your only option for that. To open the chat window, as shown in the screenshot on your screen now, there's a chat button in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen that shows a bubble and says chat. If you click on that, it'll open a pane on the right-hand side of your screen. That'll be the chat window. And to make sure that your questions are going to both all of our panelists and the other attendees today, please make sure that to field is set to everyone. Again, make sure that to field is set to everyone so that your message will go out to all of our panelists and the other attendees today. Finally, as I mentioned before, towards the end of our session, we'll also have the opportunity for you to ask questions verbally. To show that you want to ask a question verbally, please click on the raise hand feature. As shown in the screenshot now, it's in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. There's a little hand button. If you click on that raise hand button, it will raise your hand for us and indicate that you want to ask a question verbally. Towards the end, when we get to Q&A, we will unmute you, let you know that you're unmuted so you can ask your question. If you no longer wish to ask a question, or if your question has already been asked, or if you have had the chance to ask your question already, just click that button one more time. That'll lower your hand so that we don't call on you if you've already asked your question. Our speakers for today will include and be led by William Snow from HUD, the Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs, as well as Aubrey Sittler, Megan Henry, and myself, Tommy Joe Bednar from Apt Associates. With that, I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to William Snow. William?
All right. Thanks, Tommy Joe. Thanks all of you for attending. I see already our attendance is a little lower, and that actually is probably reflective of the reality that the counts started as of yesterday. I've given some exceptions to the date, and they have already begun. So congratulations. For those of you who are here, I'm guessing you still have some outstanding questions, and we hope to be able to address what we can today. So let us jump into the next slide, please. All right, as a quick reminder, what's due this year? The HIC, the sheltered PIT, and the unsheltered PIT has some caveats next to it, right? If you did an unsheltered PIT count last year in 2020, then you technically do not need to submit a waiver to HUD if you're going to try to waive some or all of the requirements. So remember, that's a change from what we had been talking about prior to the memo of January 7th. If you're going to do accounts, you still may need some interaction from HUD if you're going to change the date, or if you want to use an alternate data set to generate most of your data. We'll talk a little bit about that, but there are also lots of flexibilities. So let's go to the next slide, please. A lot of these flexibilities you don't require HUD to interact on, so you can just go ahead and do them, but our guiding principle for everything remains safety. So if your community cannot safely conduct a point-in-time count, an unsheltered point-in-time count, you still have the ability to take advantage of a waiver or seek an exception to allow greater flexibility in some areas. You also have flexibilities, again, that don't require HUD interaction. For instance, If you choose to engage in observation counts, whereas you may not have done that in the past, but you want to do it this year, we encourage that, or use stronger sampling for most of your work, or count with a longer time frame if you're using a survey, right? So instead of just doing a one-night count, counting over 7 or up to 14 days, if you have some way to deduplicate. If you're doing an observation count and you want to do it over a couple days, that also might be available. You just need to look at the dynamics of your own community. So if you have a lot of transference that happens between, a lot of mobility between your COC, yeah, that's probably not a good idea because you don't really have a way to deduplicate. If you have some fairly distinct areas where there's not a lot of transferring going on, you can conduct your counts in those areas on separate nights. So that's nice. I know some communities are definitely taking advantage of that. So we'll talk a little bit about using alternate data sets in just a moment. Let's go to the next slide, please. So what's out there that requires interaction with HUD? The waiver memo from January 7th allows communities who did not conduct a count in 2020 to seek a waiver. So you can either seek a waiver to do no unsheltered count or to do just a head count. And remember, you may want to actually count other things than just a head count. And the head count means the total count of unsheltered, of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. If you want to count more than that, that's fine. But if you're not counting all of the elements, you still need to seek an exception to only submit that total head count data. And we'll let you submit the other data. We want that data if you're collecting it, so you can submit it. But that's just the confines of the waiver memo. So those are options. If you did a count last year, you actually don't need to seek an exception for either of those principles, right? If you're not going to do an unsheltered count this year, or you're going to do a partial count, but you did a count last year, an unsheltered count, you don't need to come to us. That's the beauty of that waiver memo. However, if you plan on conducting a count, but you need to change the date outside of the last 10 days of January, you still need to send me something, and a future slide will get to that. If you want to use an alternate data set, right, let's say you want to use the by name list to generate most or all of your unsheltered point-in-time count, that also requires an interaction with me. I need to be able to approve that. You need to validate that that data is a good substitute, and we'll talk about that as well. Next slide, please. So the memo. Again, the memo published January 7th, the main benefit to all of you is it clarified that if you had done a count in 2020, an unsheltered count, you do not need to do an unsheltered count in 2021, and you do not need to notify HUD. We like it when you do counts, but again, you just need to look at your own ability and consider your own safety and those you're working with. If you did not count in 2020 and you do not plan on doing a full count, you must send me, or not me, the 2021 pit@hud.gov email address, a waiver notification. We'll talk a little bit about that. That's due by 5 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow. So even if you've sent another email to me with an exception and it was even granted, if you do not submit according to that waiver, which requires you to submit an email to that box, you are going to be expected to do a full count, and there could be penalties for not following that principle. So I can't reiterate that enough. I will tell you I've heard from almost all of the communities. It was 46 communities that fell in that boat. I think I'm down to maybe 13 or 14 I haven't heard from, and some of them may be planning on doing a full count, so it doesn't even matter for those folks. But it is something, just want to flag it for you. All right, the one final thing about the memo is you should not expect an email back from anyone at HUD if you're going to take advantage of that process. It is a waiver notification, so you send the notification to HUD, and that notification is effective upon receipt as long as it is submitted by the deadline. So there are some who have asked, hey, should I be getting some email back saying, yes, it's granted? No, it was already granted because of the waiver. You just have to fulfill the notification requirement. Please don't submit questions through that email box. You should not expect to get answers through there. So if you have questions, you go to me or the AAQ. If you want to use an alternate data set, don't go there. You got to email that to me. So just a couple points there. Let's go to the next slide, please. All right, I've gone over this enough. If there are more questions at the end or through the chat, we'll deal with them. Next slide, please. So what exactly do you have to do to take advantage of that waiver notification? Send an email to the 2021 PIT@hud.gov email box notifying us of your name, COC name and number, and telling us which waiver notification you're taking advantage of. And there's really two. You're either not going to conduct any unsheltered point-in-time count, or you're not going to conduct the full count, meaning for purposes of the waiver, you are going to count a total number of unsheltered folks or people experiencing unsheltered homelessness, and that's it. So that's what you would send in the waiver notification, and again, you should not expect an email back. And I can't state strongly enough, if it's not in by January 20th, that's tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern time, and you did not conduct a count last year, that is a problem. So please make sure that you do that, even if you submitted an exception to me before. Just make sure you're addressing that. All right, next slide, please. So there is a different process if you want to change the dates. If you need to change the date of your point-in-time count to something other than the last 10 days of January, you do need to submit an email to me stating good cause and stating your alternate date. The one clarification I want to give here is we're really talking about starting your count, right? Like what's the date you're designating for your PIT count? So if you're starting your count within the last 10 days, but you're going to count for 14 days, that's okay. You don't need to send anything then. It's just whatever the start date is, and that's the date you're going to use to, that's what you're going to call your PIT count night or your HIC night. It'll all be the same night. Next slide, please. So what about an alternate data set? We've had a good number of COCs check and verify that they can do this. I'd say we're probably around the 20 COC mark out of 390. That's pretty good. It also shows that it's a difficult standard to meet. So we did not take it lightly, and we took a lot of effort to confirm whether or not this was a possibility. If you think you have an alternate data set that could fulfill the unsheltered point-in-time count for 2020, which means you have a by name list or a combination of maybe HMIS data, including coordinated entry. You might have your coordinated entry data in another database, so you might be exporting HMIS data and coordinated entry data and combining them. There's a couple different variations I've seen. If you think that you might have a data set that meets that ability to fulfill your unsheltered point-in-time count, you can send an email request. Please include in that a comparison of the data set you plan to use run on the date of your 2020 or 2019, whatever your last unsheltered point-in-time count is. You need to run that data and compare it to the results of that same unsheltered point-in-time count. So if you're going to do it, let's say you counted last in 2020, I need you to run this alternate data set for that date, let's say January 29th, 2020. You need to run it for that date and then compare the results to your unsheltered point-in-time count data submission for that same year. If you don't do that, I'm going to make you do it. Or you need to be prepared already to say why you can't do it. Some COCs, they didn't have that data back that far, so they couldn't. We've talked about alternate ways to supplant that data. I will say that right now, it's January 19th. If you send me an email to that effect right now, there's a good chance it won't get approved now. We're out of the office tomorrow because of the inauguration and safety concerns, so we will not be checking emails tomorrow. So just want to flag that, right? This is not the best time at this point, this late in the day or late in the game to kind of say, yeah, I think an alternate data set will do it. I just won't promise that we'll have enough time to iron out the details. It does make it a little bit easier if you're a COC that did count last year. So if you have unsheltered point-in-time count data from 2020, it makes it easier for lots of reasons. But if nothing else, you don't have to submit your waiver notification by tomorrow at 5 p.m. because you already counted last year. So there is a little more time to kind of iron that piece out. Let's actually move to the next slide, please. So with that, we talked a little bit about Ssbf and the EHA program. I'm going to turn it over to Megan to talk through the details on that one.
Thank you, William. So prior to this year, this program, the Ssbf Emergency Housing Assistance Program, was really a small program that served less than 200 people, I think, in the year prior. But in this past year, it's been used to serve far more people, so it's a much bigger program. So we have been thinking through ways in which to include the people served in these programs on the HIC and the PIT. So what we have determined is because the use of the assistance is for hotel and motel rooms for the most part, which is a literal homeless situation, we are going to count these beds as emergency shelter beds on the HIC, and they will be included in your sheltered PIT count. So Ssbf grantees that are using EHA should report these people in beds on their PIT and their HIC as being served through emergency shelter. I think there's more detail on the next slide. So to do so, the beds on the HIC, they'll be marked as emergency shelter overflow beds. The funding source will be a specific funding source dedicated to this particular program type. And we're going to be including a lot more guidance in the data submission guide that will come out later in just a few weeks. And that will help determine whether these beds will be determined as HMIS participating or not, and some of the other more inventory-specific guidance will be included in that document. Next slide.
All right, Megan, thank you so much for that update. We're going to go ahead and move through a few common questions before we get to our open Q&A. And William, I think this first one we're going to start off with you. Should CoCs include safe parking and or camping sites in their HIC and on their sheltered PIT count?
All right, great question. The short answer is no. Just as in years past, we would count the same things that qualify as shelter. We have not to date changed our standards such that we allow safe parking or camping sites to be included in the sheltered point in time, or the sheltered point in time count, or the HIC as sheltered sites. So they will continue to be included in the count only as persons experiencing unsheltered homelessness, and the structures associated, right, the tents or the cars would not be included in a sheltered project.
Perfect. Thank you so much, William. And can you talk a little bit about how emergency shelter beds should be counted and reported on the HIC if they're from a decompressed shelter setting?
Yeah, so there's two answers to this one. It just depends on your local setting. I think the starting place is it depends on how you set up your shelters way back when you started your engagement. A lot of this has to do with the COVID response. We provided HMIS setup guidance and allowed some flexibility locally. The areas of flexibility included two major categories, right? So if you are a shelter and you had 100 beds and you decompressed and now you have 50 beds in your existing shelter and you have 50 beds that are now taken care of through hotel motels, but really, like, as a facility or as a project, you still have 100-bed capacity. You have the ability to say, I'm a 100-bed facility, and just keep it that way in HMIS, and it would show up as a facility-based emergency shelter. That's actually how you're reported in the HIC as well. We're not going to make you create another project for the 50 hotel motel voucher beds when they're really part of your existing capacity. So that's the big one there. A lot of you, I think, acted that way in HMIS. We think that's great. Yes, we're going to miss a little bit of the data in terms of how many beds are actually in vouchers versus facilities. We're comfortable with losing some of that if it means not killing you guys with data collection, right? We do enough of that. We're going to give some leeway on this one. However, if you had a project that increased capacity, right, take that 100-bed facility, and instead of having 50 beds in hotel motel, you actually had 150 beds, That additional 100 beds, our guidance earlier was when you're changing your capacity, you're actually changing the nature of your facility. You should create a new HMIS entry to reflect that. And so you would, again, you would just take your HIC or your HMIS-based project setup as your foundation for this. That additional set of beds are probably set up or hopefully set up in HMIS as a separate project. You'll report it as such in the HIC. So HMIS setup's the real key to all of this. Hopefully all of that is already done. I have been noticing, based on some questions I've received, that there are some jurisdictions that have local funded or state funded programs where they're not participating in HMIS. That is a problem, whether that's decompressed facilities or otherwise. We do expect you to collect and report on all of your shelter data. That is one of our requirements. So if they're not in HMIS, that could be okay if they're collecting all the elements required for the HIC, or if you have a process for reaching out to folks in that facility to gather their data, which is normal, right? That happens in every counting year. There are plenty of projects that aren't in HMIS, and the COC has to account for that by going out and collecting surveys. So if there are concerns with this or a misunderstanding about what to do there, submit an AAQ. We'll talk to you about that, but I will say that our standard for now is you should be prepared to account for every bed and the persons in them, along with whatever data is required for the sheltered point in time count. All right, give it back to you, Tommy Joe.
Thank you, William. We're going to go ahead and move into some broader questions that aren't necessarily about the HIC. And this will also head off a few questions that have been added into the chat. William, can you just explain the deadline for notification of using the waiver and for getting a request in for using an alternative data set or for changing the date of the PIT count?
Yep. So if you did not count, do an unsheltered count in 2020, and you do not want to do the full unsheltered point in time count, you must submit a waiver by January 20th at 5 p.m. So that's tomorrow, 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Tomorrow, 5 p.m. Eastern Time, that's got to be submitted. That email must state your COC name and number and must state what waiver you're taking advantage of. And that's either you're not going to do an unsheltered count at all, or you plan on doing a total count of persons experiencing unsheltered homelessness only. So that's the waiver. If you did count last year and you do not plan on counting this year, and again, that's only the unsheltered count, you don't have to send me anything. Prior to the January 7th memo, we were doing exceptions and going back and forth. You don't have to do that thanks to that waiver memo, or even if you're going to shorten what you're going to count. I appreciate those emails. We still are keeping track of what data we're getting in or not getting in, but that's not required. If you plan on conducting a count, but you are going to fulfill that requirement by using an alternate data set, that means you're not planning on conducting an unsheltered count as you traditionally would. You also need to send an email. That needs to come to me. While there's not a deadline, I will say you have no guarantees of a response at this point. If you're going to count in like 2 days, yeah, I'm not guaranteeing you that you're going to get an email from me allowing that acceptance. So we're now to the point where your timeline is shrunk. There's not a deadline, but the alternate data set, I will say that would be very hard to get approved after this office hours. How about the date? So you can submit a request to change the date from the last 10 days of January. There's no deadline on that either. Again, I would expect to see almost all of those in by now, but one of the reasons we have that is to account for things that you don't expect. So if there is a massive snowstorm that you could not predict, or some other event, maybe an extra surge that you couldn't predict in your communities, or a breakout in a major shelter that causes problems, right? Like anything that needs that date change, you have the ability to email and request an exception. The one thing to note on that I didn't note earlier, we do not plan on changing your submission timeline. So if your date changes, that will not change when you submit your data to HUD. And that traditionally has been the end of April, April 30th. So if you're going to request a date exception, you must be able to say, and I will be able to submit all my data by April 30th, 2021. So that's the one caveat with the data exception that I just want to make sure everyone is aware of.
William, I'm sorry to have to make you talk a little bit more about exceptions and waivers. You talked about this just a little bit, what you just said, but just to call it out one more time because so many people are asking in the chat. So if a COC that wanted to do anything, still wanted to do an unsheltered count, but not a full unsheltered count, did one last year, do they need to submit a waiver notification?
They only need to submit a waiver notification if they did not count in 2020. So if you did a count in 2020 and you want to alter, as in reduce what you collect and submit to HUD for the unsheltered point in time count, you can do that without even notifying us. You can move forward. If you're not sure whether you counted last year, and again, it's not really about whether you counted, it's about whether you submitted data to HUD, because there are some communities that count who don't submit their data to HUD. It's really, did you submit it to us? So if you're not sure if you submitted your data to HUD, if I were you, I would submit the notification anyways. It does not harm you to have that notification in. It just doesn't, it's not a benefit either, unless you're just unsure whether or not you have counted already or your data was submitted. So that's the real parameter. You just got to look at, did I submit the unsheltered pit count data to HUD last year? If so, man, you have all sorts of flexibility. That's great. If not, you don't have a lot of flexibility. You need to submit a waiver notification by tomorrow at 5 p.m.
Perfect. Thank you so much, William. And I think we actually got ahead a little bit already on our next common question. So a recurring common question that we want to double check on is if purchasing PPE for the unsheltered count is an eligible expense.
Yeah, I love this. I want you guys to look at the costs available. So this is great. Yes, you're in the COC realm, like COC program funding, you can always use your planning dollars. That's great. If you want to use COC program funding and you have street outreach, you could use that funding to pay for PPE either for your street outreach workers if they're engaged in street outreach work, right? So not doing an observation count, but actually like engaging with people, conducting traditional street outreach. You can also use the street outreach funds to pay for PPE for people you are counting, right? Because you're providing them that service and an engagement that's allowable. That same set of street outreach allowances also apply to ESG funding. So ESG or ESG-CB, if you have street outreach workers engaged in street outreach activities, or you are planning on giving things to people you're engaging in the count, you can use your street outreach funding to pay for the PPE associated with that. You can also use ESG or ESG-CB admin funding to pay for PPE for volunteers or street outreach staff, or again, if street outreach or other staff are not really doing street outreach activities, right? They're doing an observation count, for instance, not engaging. You can still use ESG or ESG-CB admin funds to pay for the PPE for that. That you can't use that funding for purchasing PPE to hand out to people. That's a street outreach cost, not an admin cost. So I think that aligns all of the cost allowances under our funding.
Thank you so much, William. That closes what we had already listed as common questions. So I want to take a moment to share with you all and go over the resources that are posted to the HUD Exchange. The one that we've referenced the most is the new CPD memo on the availability of waivers for the point-in-time count for unsheltered homelessness. This is the waiver that William has been talking about and outlines the process for notifying of use of that waiver. There's also the conducting the 2021 unsheltered pit count, the how to use sampling within a COC guidance, and an example pit count observation form. And finally, as many of you are referencing and asking about, for non-congregate shelter, for decompressed shelter, the HMIS project setup, and inventory changes document. All of these can be found on the HUD Exchange. When the slides go out, these hyperlinks will be active, and we'll also be putting the URLs into the chat as we continue. There are also a number of general PIT count resources on the PIT count and HIC landing page on the HUD Exchange, and these include things like the PIT count methodology guide, the PIT count office hours recordings, such as today once we have that posted, and the PIT count survey tools. With that, we are going to move into our open Q&A. Thank you to all of you who have already been putting questions into the chat. Please continue doing that, especially if your question has not been asked by anyone else yet. We also want to make sure that you know that you can ask questions verbally. If you would like to ask a question verbally, as shown in the screenshot here, go ahead and click on the raise hand feature, and that will raise your hand and let us know that you want to be unmuted and ask a question. If that happens, we'll let you know that you're unmuted. If your question's already been asked or you have a chance to ask it, please just click that one more time to lower your hand. At this point, we do not have anyone with their hand raised to ask a question verbally, so we're going to move into some of your chat questions. First and foremost, we have a few questions about surveys and observations. And we have one attendee who would like to know that if they're surveying someone who is experiencing homelessness who doesn't want to answer the question on a PIT count survey, what are the limitations on what can be observed and recorded from an observation only? They've heard some talk about things about not assuming gender, ethnicity, et cetera, but could we go over what those limitations are and what they should and should not be recording in an observation?
So that's a great question. We should start with we always want to respect people's feelings on that. I think generally it reflects a lot of how the COC is able to train and engage folks. We have found that a good training with a comfortable set of volunteers generally results in few people rejecting questions or not wanting to answer anything. That's not universally true, though. There are some folks who just are not comfortable, especially with COVID, right? Like it's not the same as every other year this year, who may simply say, no, I don't want to count. So if I were you at a CFC and I were going to have this allowance that I'm going to do, maybe I'm going to do a one-night count with a short survey, but I'm going to have the option for my counters to tally folks who choose to not answer all of the questions or any of the questions, then you can use the opportunity to tally them. I would take identification pieces, right? Where were they sleeping? What could you identify? However, I would not suggest doing things like demographics. You certainly can't really identify subpopulation data, right? Like were they HIV positive or veteran status? Like you just can't know that. So plan for having these gaps, use the extrapolation tool to account for them, right? Like get what you can in terms of deduplication and then account for the demographics and other things through extrapolation. So that would be the starting point. I will say that some people are willing to answer some questions and not all. You should do that. You should collect whatever people are comfortable giving you. Don't assume that if they say, no, I don't want to answer this question, it means they don't want to answer any question. So I would ensure that you're very clear on what they're willing to answer and what they're not willing to answer, and then use that same approach of collect what you can get, if not extrapolate to account for it.
Wonderful. We have another attendee who is asking if their COC can use program data or other data from HMIS to complete their point-in-time count, and if so, do they need extra consent or notification and consent from clients who they're using this data for?
It's a great question. So the answer to that one is maybe, right? Like it depends on what exactly you're saying. If you're saying your folks are not conducting any counts, you're not sending out any staff or people to do a count, that would be the alternate data set piece. You would need to submit something to me and be prepared to go back and forth on that. If you're saying, no, we're going to do a count, but in the event that we know those folks are already in the system, we don't want to spend the time asking them questions, which is fine. You just need to have a way within your system to flag them for the purposes of the count. I don't believe this would have any issues with your local privacy notice. I always would suggest you look at your privacy allowances for you to be able to go into HMIS and tally up the data on persons you know were in HMIS for the purposes of your PID count. Again, you're going to use that in aggregate form to submit the HUD. You wouldn't be submitting any PII or anything. But it's always good to look at your local privacy notice just to verify what you're allowed to do. And if there is a restriction, you may consider just submitting a total count instead of the demographic and other data. That way you don't really have an issue of collecting things. You're really just validating for deduplication purposes, and that puts you in a much safer camp if you're at all concerned. So that's the recommendation that I would give. Did that answer the full question, Tommy Joe?
It seemed to from what was already asked, but if anyone who either originally asked this question or has a similar question feels like there's part of this that still needs to be asked or that you didn't get a full answer on, please feel free to add some nuance or add some specificity to your question, either again in the chat or by raising your hand. Again, if you'd like to ask a question verbally, just click on that little raise hand feature. But for now, that seemed to answer that question. We have a methodology question asking if a COC can conduct a survey-based count before the evening designated as the night of the point in time counts.
No. The count is tied to the very first date of the count. We don't do prospective sleeping arrangements just because they're tenuous, especially with the population we're talking about. So point in time counts really starts on the night of the first survey or observation-based event. So that should be your trigger for what you count for your point in time count.
Perfect. And for Megan, and we may have to punt a little bit on this question, but we have a few people asking if Ssbf EHA beds have an HMIS requirement and or when we'll know whether Ssbf EHA is HMIS or non-HMIS participating.
Mm-hmm. So if these beds are in your HMIS already, they're likely under rapid rehousing. And because of the sort of discrepancy between how we're asking you to report them for the HIC and how you might have them already set up in your HMIS, we are just sort of doing our last due diligence to make sure that that having them marked as non-participating is the best way. That's where we're sort of heading. But by the time we send these slides out and the notes from this call, we'll have that decision made. That's my best guess at this point, though.
So I want to add one thing there. We have been talking with the VA. We don't want to make this decision for the VA, even though it's our data collection. Their inclination, as is ours, is to not add an additional data collection burden. So it is highly unlikely that we would create or require Ssbf recipients to create an alternate emergency shelter project setup for these EHA projects. That just is not realistic for anybody. We understand that, the VA understands it, so I would not expect that to be the case. We will do what we can to provide guidance so that you can use the existing data to fulfill the reporting requirement. But again, there are certainly implications about participating versus non-participating, how that plays out in the future for LSA. We're aware of those things and we're working through them, but they shouldn't impact this initial data collection. You should count on collecting people in EHA projects or receiving EHA services and reporting them as sheltered point in time count folks, and be prepared to speak to the number of beds associated with them as emergency shelter beds. So, and again, we'll provide some guidance to help you with that.
Moving on to a few HIC and project questions. William, can you talk about how communities should evaluate whether they should include projects or abodes such as pallet shelters, tiny shelters, those sorts of things in their HIC and their sheltered pits?
Yes, it's hard to cover all of that because they all run the gamut. What we generally do is we look at the nature of the facility and we check to see if they meet some basic habitability requirements. The core ones that we require every facility to have in order to be counted at all as sheltered would be, does it have access to electricity? There has to be a bare minimum level of electricity. If for nothing else, there must be some lighting available to folks. So there needs to be some electricity that must be to the unit, so the sleeping unit itself. There must be access to showers and toilets. If it is a larger facility, we don't require that toilet facility or shower be in everyone's individual unit, but it must be reasonably accessible on the site. So again, if that's one large community center that's being used as a shelter and they have adequate bathrooms, right, more than one bathroom for 100 people, that certainly wouldn't count, right? So an adequate number, you could use that bathroom and apply it, and that's okay. If you're a type of campus where somebody can't access that without going outside, you just have to take into account reasonableness of it. For instance, if you're in an area that gets into freezing temperatures and somebody has to walk 100 yards to go to the bathroom, I would say that's unreasonable, would not allow that. It needs to be someplace that somebody can safely leave their unit to get to a bathing or a toilet facility as needed. So that's another one. We also look at the ability to have an eating space, right, a kitchen space for preparing food or eating food that is safe within the facility. Again, that doesn't have to be in the unit itself, but it needs to be in a reasonably accessible place on the campus or within the single building. Another one is ability to adjust for climate. So similar examples before, if you have below freezing temperatures, you must have a running HVAC or heating allowance. You could do that through a burning stove, right? It doesn't have to be a traditional heating system, but it absolutely has to be some sort of system that is appropriate to the weather. You could flip that in really hot temperatures. You need to have access to air conditioning or fans that are sufficient to cool folks. So that's one. That's four. I'm going to give you a fifth criteria that we look at, and that is 4 walls and a roof. So if you do not have an enclosed facility that has doors to close the facility, that is not counted as a sheltered facility. It is not, in fact, sheltered. So you must have a facility, again, 4 walls, a roof, and be able to close that facility off. If for no other reason, that's for safety, but certainly to account for weather conditions. So those are the 5 main criteria we look for. There are some facilities that will not get HUD funding and don't meet the HUD requirements. The HUD requirements are a little more strict. This is the lower standard, those 5 items. So you need to be able to meet that minimum standard. And then you have some discretion locally to determine, do I meet those standards? Is this something we should count? And sometimes it's tough. I think of the Alaska example. Their conditions are really tough already. They asked if they could use a warming cabin as shelters. And that warming cabin had no way to adjust for weather, and it had no electricity, but it was walls to keep people out from extreme snow or cold conditions. We said that cannot be counted as sheltered based on our minimum standard there. Again, does that mean that facility is bad? No, it's better than being outside, but we can't count it as sheltered. We still count that as unsheltered. So you just have to look at your own local conditions and see, again, do you meet that basic 5 set of requirements? And if you're unsure, send an AAQ. We're happy to kind of noodle through that with you.
William, thank you so much for going into such deep detail on that question to help answer a lot of the questions from our attendees on today's office hours. In a similar and related question, we have a number of attendees who are asking about how to handle their warming shelters, especially ones that may or may not have mats and or beds, or that they might be optional and not everyone is sleeping overnight in warming shelters. How do they handle those on their sheltered pit count and their HIC?
Yeah, so we actually follow the same criteria we do for normal shelters, right? Start with, is the facility, can it be considered dedicated to persons experiencing homelessness? Our notice generally covers that, and you can use the past notice if there's questions about that. But generally, you're doing it for life-saving purposes or people experiencing homelessness. You would count the people in the beds and all the beds available in that facility. You need to consider beds, right? So there are some facilities that have overflow, and people are not in beds because of maybe an extreme condition, or right, maybe they're sleeping on a chair, or some sleeping on the ground. We wouldn't count that. Those folks we would count as unsheltered, right? They're not actually in a bed. So that's another condition that I actually didn't state with the last one, but kind of applies here, is they actually need to have a place to sleep, and it needs to be a bed of sorts. So it's not uncommon for folks to pull out cot and to use that, again, as part of their overflow or warming shelter. And generally, we think of warming shelters as being counted. The one other thing to note is we do want you to count those that are used for sleeping. There are a lot of day shelters that do a lot of great work. We do not count day shelters if they're only serving that function of providing day shelter services. We only include facilities that are providing overnight accommodations, right, that actually give a bed. So just bear that in mind. We did have some follow-up questions about that in the AAQ, and they were great questions. Yep, only count those facilities that are used for sleeping. Tommy Jo, does that cover everything? That's a good question. There's a lot there.
There is a lot there. I think that has covered what we have in about warming shelters so far. If your community has a different sort of nuanced warming shelter that isn't covered about what William just shared, please feel free to send that message in, again, via the chat, or if you'd like to ask a question verbally, you can hit the raise hand feature, or if you're joining us by phone for audio or just phone alone, you can hit *3 on your phone, and that will raise your hand on our end so that we can unmute you and call you. Again, if you're on phone, that's *3. We don't have anyone with a raised hand, though, at the moment. So we're going to move on to, we have a number of questions about hotels and motels. First and foremost, just starting from the basics, William, for hotels or motels that are used as part of the homeless services system, should those be included in the PIT and the HIC?
Yes, they should be included.
Perfect. And as a follow-up for that, should they be considered sheltered or unsheltered?
Those be included as sheltered. Wonderful.
And if this is part of shelter decompression or ESG funding or other non-congregate shelter changing or COVID response, how should those be treated and handled on both the sheltered PIT and the HIC?
Yep, so for the sheltered PIT, it's easy for all of those. All persons in those facilities should be counted. How they're counted, again, depends on your project setup. If it's a decompression facility, and again, you're serving essentially the same capacity through the two modes, your existing facility and your project and your hotel motel vouchers, you would keep it essentially tied to that facility-based emergency shelter. You don't need to change anything from your HMIS. You just essentially use the data on the number of beds available and the people in them that you already have recorded in HMIS. If you did something else in HMIS, you wanted to record those decompressed beds separately, or you added capacity so you created a new project to reflect that, you would simply follow what you had set up in HMIS already. I know in our AAQ we also got questions about Project Room Key, and that's the California project used essentially as non-congregate shelters in this COVID environment. Those are generally included. The one exception is there are some areas that have beds that were exclusively for people experiencing homelessness, and some that had projects set up that really worked for people experiencing homelessness and didn't primarily serve people experiencing homelessness. If your state or you're a project that falls in that category, then you would not include the projects that are specifically including people not experiencing homelessness. If you have that distinction, yes, you get to exclude those projects. If you don't have the distinction and you're not sure, you should default with those are emergency shelter beds. That's the way to think of it. But again, many CoCs were set up their project collection or data collection in HMIS in such a way to make that distinction, so they kind of knew who's serving homeless, who's not. So again, follow those guidelines for that.
William, as a converse question to that, for shelters that have had to lower their specific physical capacity for their maximum capacity because of COVID, how should they report their capacity and bed availability on their HIC?
You'll follow the same rules as normal. You'll actually just report what you have on the night of the count. Again, I think the one exception there is if you did decompression and you supplemented your decompression efforts with hotel motel, if you kept that in the same project setup in HMIS, you just report it all as one. But if you simply decompress and you didn't supplement, at least you as a single shelter, you just didn't think of the new hotel motel vouchers as an extension of that effort or that project, then you'll just report the decompressed beds. So that's okay. Just recognize some folks are nervous, like, what is this going to look like in reporting and how is HUD going to treat it? We're aware there's all sorts of craziness associated with COVID. Some areas are going to have huge influxes of beds. Some are going to have huge decreases. We're all over the map on it. We're aware of it. We don't want you to focus on those implications. We will do our best to make sure that there's no negative repercussions for you taking appropriate safety measures. We just want you to report what you did. Report what you got on the night of the HIC, and report the shelter point-in-time count folks as well.
William, we have some very specific community questions continued on the hotel-motel trends. We have a couple of attendees who are asking about hotel-motel vouchers or beds that are used because of fire relocation. One community was asking about because of wildfires, another just said for fire relocation. And not all of them are tracked in HMIS. Are these considered emergency shelter, and should they be included on their sheltered pit and their HIC?
Great question. So we allow a little more flexibility when there's a natural disaster that's driving the change. Generally, we would encourage CoCs to include them and include them as overflow, and there is a section in the HIC where you can identify specifically disaster-based beds. This does not actually apply to the COVID beds. This applies to natural disasters. So you can indicate that these are natural disaster-based beds. Because especially our interaction with FEMA, like we've known, often it's trailers put on the ground very quickly or dispersed hotel motel, and the data collection, given the time frame and the nature of the natural disaster, the data collection is either not there or suffers. So we give CoCs with these natural disasters the ability to determine what they have and whether what they have is sufficient to include. If they don't have sufficient data, we've allowed them to exclude them, but they need to be prepared to respond locally as to how the wildfires or whatever natural disaster impacted their homeless population. So that's the one caveat. We do give a little more flexibility there, knowing largely that this isn't really impacting your year-round inventory so much. It's at least in the long term, this is a short-term blip, and it's hard to get some of that.
Perfect. If anyone else has other specific questions on hotel motels, please be sure to add those to the chat and or to raise your hand. We'll move back to hotel motels in a minute. We're going to continue on with a few questions that we've received about point-in-time count methodology. William, we have an attendee who's asking if they have pop-up events on the week of the count and are exploring the option of surveying people who will go to the event, but are already planning to do ground survey / counts. Do they need to stick to that methodology and not count during the pop-up? I believe they're asking if they plan to do a night of count, can they combine that with a service-based count across the week of the point-in-time count and the days following?
So it depends is the short answer. And the dependency is based on how you do your normal point in time count, or whatever it is that we're calling normal for this year. If you're doing some sort of survey in that night of count effort, then absolutely, right? You would have enough data between the two data sets to be able to distinguish or deduplicate the data. That's a great thing to do. It's great to do it on non-COVID years, but on these this rough COVID year, absolutely acceptable. If your folks are only doing an observation count, and then you're also having these service-based counts with surveys, you probably don't have a way to deduplicate. So that's going to be a problem. I would say it's not likely that you can do that. There are some communities, especially states, where they developed a strata already, right? Like they've determined what communities are similar to each other. And some of them are saying we're going to do surveys in these types of communities, and we're just going to do observation in these other types. That you actually can mix your methodologies in that case. You just have to make sure you're kind of keeping your parts of the COC together, right? So you keep all the data from your survey-based sites together. You can even create strata within that, but those need to stay together. You shouldn't mix those, at least for sampling and extrapolation purposes. You shouldn't mix those together. So that's a complicated last answer there. Really, that shouldn't be happening unless you're a large COC where you can count differently in areas because there's no real transferring of people experiencing homelessness into other areas. If you're unsure if that applies to you, you certainly can send an email or an AAQ, and we'll talk through that. That's a great question, but a lot of nuance to it.
Wonderful. Thank you, William. We have someone who is saying that they'd like some clarification on if it's permissible for an unsheltered PIT count to have some demographics and some observations. They're saying that they thought it was only all questions answered with all demographics or just observation only. So could you talk a little bit about having some observations with missing demographic information, William?
So we would discourage collecting demographic data through observation, largely because we want people to identify with their gender, identify with their race, and that is something that we discourage others making those decisions for them, right? Like that's an important identification principle, and we want people to have that opportunity. So we discourage collecting demographic data through observation. You may still be collecting observation data along with survey, though. In that case, we would just encourage you to do extrapolation, right? So treat it as if there was no data collected other than a head count on those folks that you observed, and then use the extrapolation tool and that would be, again, basing the data you did collect in surveys, using that as the basis for the gap that you have to fill. So you'd extrapolate to account for the observations that you had with no other data.
All right. So returning to non-congregate shelter, decompressed COVID beds, and hotels, we've had quite a few questions on that, even though we've had the opportunity to answer many of them. First and foremost, William, we have an attendee asking for a definition or general definition of what decompressed means, what decompressed beds mean.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I don't know what the technical term is, but I'll tell you how we're using it for the purposes of the HIC. Decompress means you shrunk your existing capacity. So you changed or altered your capacity, you lowered it in order to account for COVID safety precautions. That's the decompression piece of it. And again, the example would be you had 100 beds closely spaced together, maybe 2 to 3 feet apart. That did not meet the safety precautions outlined by CDC, which varied a little bit from 6 to 12 feet, depending on some of the time frames of the memos. So you, in order to comply, you spaced out your beds, and as a result, you couldn't house as many people in that facility. That's the act of decompressing your facility to allow for the safety precautions to be put into place. So when we say decompression, that's how we're using that term.
Wonderful, and thank you to the attendee who asked that. William, we have another attendee who says that they have an emergency shelter that's run by their city specifically for COVID reasons and does enter data into the HMIS system. Is that something that should be included on the HIC even though it's temporary and not affiliated with the COC?
Yeah, the not affiliated with the COC is less important, right? If they're in the COC's jurisdiction and they're serving people experiencing homelessness, yeah, absolutely should include it. I think your challenge is determining whether or not those beds are actually going to people experiencing homelessness, right? Is this a larger effort that also encompasses maybe retirement or different facilities for the elderly, right, like nursing homes? Or you just need to look at the parameters of your actual effort there. If it turns out that it's largely homeless, maybe not 100%, but largely, yeah, include the whole thing. If they have a good sense of like, it's 50%, and on any given day, it's 50%. If I were you, I would just enter the project using the 50% number, right, prorated from the get-go. Again, I would say look at your HMIS, though. Hopefully some of those parameters are already set up, and you're really just kind of cheating and using your HMIS data to feed the HIC and the shelter pit responses.
Wonderful. So we have a question a little more generally about how to report beds for an emergency shelter, hotel, motel projects if it's voucher-based and based on funding availability. So how should they report the numbers for that night?
So how should they report it if it's not it's not project-based? So they can't say, I have 100 beds on any given night. They just have whatever voucher amount they have available that night?
Exactly. Availability until the funding runs out.
Yeah, you just report based on the night of. Like, that's what the HIC does. That's a good and bad thing, right? Like, in a case like this where there's high flexibility or fluctuation, that makes it difficult. We found this is one of the struggles with rapid rehousing, right? A lot of times those vouchers programs, by the time you get to January, some of those programs, though they operate all year round, may have few, if any, vouchers available during that night, and they don't get counted. Again, that's rapid rehousing, permanent housing. It doesn't impact your sheltered pit, but for the purposes of the HIC, it would. This same principle applies to shelter or other voucher-based facilities. You're just going to report what's going on the night of the HIC. Great.
So I have a question I'm going to throw out to all of our panelists. We've had a few people who have asked about the HDX setup for reporting based on submitting no unsheltered data, head count, having different NCS and COVID inventory, mostly just wanting to know if it will be set up to accommodate all of these differences this year.
So I'm going to defer to Megan or Aubrey to answer that.
In short, yes. All of the accommodations made by HUD will be reflected in the HDX. So if you are just doing a head count and there are no demographics, we will likely be removing validations around those demographic checks and similar checks around funding sources on the HIC, and just it will be a bit of a different year on the HDX, I suspect. But anything that you are allowed to do through HUD, you will be able to submit through the HDX.
So the only clarification I would give based on some AAQs and chat things in the past is this really is a COC level submission. So the one thing that we definitely will not accommodate is if a COC wants to submit for one city, but it's a 10 city or 10 county COC, you can't do that. It's all or nothing for the COC. So just be aware that this is COC-wide level data. If you're missing some things, but you have enough to extrapolate, do that. If you're missing some things and you don't have enough to extrapolate, I hope you've asked for a waiver, right, just in case for your unsheltered data. So just remember COC-wide level submission.
Wonderful. So we have a question from an attendee who their COC is planning on not doing their unsheltered point in time count this year. And the attendee wants to know if how this will affect their system performance measures and their LSA in 2021.
Megan or Aubrey, maybe you guys should start on that one. That might be the best place to start.
Oh, Megan, you are muted.
I'm not sure we've actually put in place any sort of understanding around the SPM for next year. Aubrey, do you have anything to add here? I actually do not have anything to add.
I do not have anything to add to that, no.
Yeah, so it depends on if the question is about like, how will this impact your data submission versus how will this impact how HUD reviews the data? Those are definitely two different types of questions. For the purposes of submission, again, we're actually going to follow a lot of the same HMIS project setup rules. So that, again, is going to lead so much of what you submit both in the LSA and what you submit in the SPMs. So make sure you follow the HMIS project setup guidance. That's really, really important. And that's what we're going to be using. The implications may be hard to kind of tease out in terms of like scoring or how that gets presented for discussion around performance. I will say that we are aware again that this year is crazy and it actually really impacts like 3 years, right? It's hard to compare this year to last year. It'll be hard to compare this year to the next year, and the next year will be kind of an odd baseline as well. So we just know that there's weird implications, and it'll touch really 3 years of data for purposes of comparison. So we'll take that into account as best we can with the parameters we have.
Perfect. William, speaking of this year being different from other years, and we've had a few questions past and present about this, how would you guide communities to help present and explain this data, not in their HDX submission, but as they talk with their community, with their lawmakers, with their partners, with their funders, about how different this year is and what PIT and PIT count data means this year?
Yeah, that's a great one. Messaging is going to be tough. So this is the way we're approaching it at HUD, especially knowing that we have a lot of CoCs that are not going to do any count or going to do some sort of modified count. We are planning on messaging in very, very general terms. None of this like 8.3% increase or decrease. We're not going to talk in those terms. We're going to be talking in terms of it appears that in this type of geography that there was an increase or there was a decrease. We won't be able to say much more than that, and you are likely in the same camp. Even for those of you who have data, I would, again, be very cautious in how you present that and just say COVID impacted us. This is the data we have based on how we collected it, and we made some modifications to account for safety reasons. It tells us generally we went up, we went down. If you did not do a count, I also, quite frankly, would use that as an opportunity to say our community was heavily impacted. This was the known impact of COVID on our community, not using PIT data, using other data you already have, and tell the message that your population, these people that we're serving, they were impacted, and we needed to assist them, and you didn't do an unsheltered point-in-time count because they're impacted and you couldn't safely count them. So with a commitment that you plan on getting that data in the future and you're continuing to monitor the situation and do all you can to serve them, but let them know that we value and prioritize their safety, and we will act accordingly. And that actually hopefully will flow through with the other data sets, right? System performance. If all of you use non-congregate shelter, or many of you, your length of time homeless is going to look very different, right? We made some modifications to allow for people to be longer, or tried to encourage people to be able to stay longer in various settings. So you may have to account for that. That's fine. That's part of your, we are responding. This is a pandemic, national and international-wide pandemic, and we are responding. So, again, that's HUD's take. I'd encourage you to do that. Hopefully you can cheat and use our messaging a little bit and just say, look, HUD said this, right? Don't look too far into this. This is how you should look at it. You should absolutely leverage that if it benefits you.
Thank you so much for that, William. We have a very normal PIT and HIT question next. An attendee is asking, given a scenario where there's a couple with one person under the age of 25 and one person over the age of 25, is this couple considered an unaccompanied youth household or adults for the purposes of the sheltered PIT counts?
I'm going to let Aubrey answer that one. I'll support, but Aubrey?
Thanks, William. So I had stuck into the chat 2 different FAQs that we published a couple of years ago that speak to this. And honestly, looking at those FAQs is probably going to be your best option for figuring out how to submit this, because there's some nuance to it that you might not pick up on just from a verbal response. But the long story short is, you know, we've heard from people before who have said, we have someone who is 17 who's dating somebody and is a parent with somebody who's 27. How do we report them in our PIT count? Because technically they are a young person who has a child, so they are parenting, but there's somebody over the age of 25 in their household. And the long story short is the age of the older parent in a parenting household determines whether or not you're counting the household as a parenting youth household, and where to stick those folks on your PIT count. And there's a little chart on that FAQ, which I will stick back in the chat, that clarifies kind of what to do with that information. When it is an unaccompanied young person, so they're not with a parent, but they are maybe with somebody who is over the age of 25 or older, but they don't have any of their own children with them, then it's actually up to your COC whether you report those folks as a single household or whether you separate them and report them as individuals in their own households. If you report them as a single household, then again, you're going to use the age of the older person to determine whether they are an unaccompanied youth household or just a household with 2 adults if the younger person is 18 to 24, or technically a household with children if the younger person is under 18. But I think, you know, a lot of COCs end up just reporting them as separate households for like more authentic data collection and reporting and analysis of who it is that they're serving. Megan, do you have anything else that you want to add to that?
No, I would just say the example that was given in the chat, it sounds like if the older parent is older, just to clarify, if the older parent is older than 25, then that household would be counted as a household with children. So a family household.
Thanks for that.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. William, we had a few people who jumped on a little bit late or just missed kind of the top line explanation about who needs to send in a waiver notification and what happens if they've sent an exception request in before. Can you just go over and break out the groups of who needs to send in a notification and by when and why?
Yep, sure. So waiver notifications are required to be submitted by tomorrow, that's January 20th at 5 p.m. This really only applies to COCs that did not conduct a count last year, an unsheltered count in 2020. So if you did not conduct an unsheltered count in 2020 and you do not plan on submitting all of the unsheltered data, you must submit a waiver. That is regardless of whether you went back and forth with me through exceptions. The waiver memo requires you to take advantage of that through that email address in there, which is 2021pit@hud.gov. You must submit through that process because the waiver is kind of like regulatory authority in that way. That's the way to think of it. It's waiving a regulatory requirements. You must follow the requirements of the waiver. So the exception emails we did back and forth do not fulfill that waiver notification requirement. So I can't make that any more clear, I think. You must submit a waiver if you didn't commit or didn't conduct a count last year and you still want to have some sort of lower count requirement for 2021 for unsheltered. If you did a count last year, you really don't have to do anything. So if you did an unsheltered count, whether you decide to count this year or not, you don't have to notify us. You can change your plans or do what you will, and you don't have to tell us. That doesn't alter your sheltered point-in-time count requirement or your HIC requirement. Those are required regardless of your status. But if you counted last year, did an unsheltered count, you don't have to do one this year, and you don't have to notify us. If you want to change the date, you must notify me. That one follows a different process, so you must submit an exception request to me. There's some flexibility on the timing. You just got to say why you're doing it, show that you have good cause, and provide the alternative date that you're using. And you must be prepared to submit by April 30th this year. If you want to use an alternate data set to fulfill your data submission requirements for the unsheltered point-in-time count, that also requires an email to me. You're altering how you do your count, so I need to make sure that that data is an acceptable substitute for the normal unsheltered point-in-time count effort, so we need to go back and forth on that to verify that that's an acceptable data set. As I said earlier, it's late in the game to be approving alternate data sets. If you're submitting or hoping to submit an email to that effect, just given again how late it is, it may or may not get accepted, right? It's just, we're on January 19th, 4:15 p.m. Eastern time. That's going to be hard to approve those given the back and forth on all the other ones. So just be prepared on that.
Wonderful. William, we have a follow-up question to a question from earlier about voucher programs, and it might be worth breaking out emergency shelter and rapid rehousing separately. But we had an attendee who wanted to know if the utilization rate for the point-in-time count for voucher programs, shelter, and rapid rehousing would be 100%.
Generally, yes. For voucher or for RRH, yes, it's essentially a one-for-one if you're using a voucher-based approach. For the shelters, generally, yes. For both of those, we have said, like, if you have a set number of vouchers that you've committed to and you're going to do every month, you know, so you've said we will always have 20 vouchers in this program on any given day of the month, then you would actually report that. I'm not really aware of a community that says this is like an absolute. Most say we have this funding, we're going to provide vouchers as available. We plan on doing as many of this, you know, as many as 20, but we'll alter how we provide assistance based on the households we're serving and the requests we receive. So for the most part, you should count on vouchers equal people or households, and we're okay with that.
All right. William, returning to a few of the habitability standards, we have an overarching question from an attendee who asked if those 4 to 5 habitability standards and kind of criteria that you mentioned earlier, if those exist in a document somewhere.
It is not in the document. I need to look, maybe Aubrey or Megan know. I think we have an FAQ that outlines those standards, and we've used that for people to reference to. We've certainly used it in the AAQ, so if you want it laid out, especially given where we are in timing, I'd say submit an AAQ and we can make sure that you have that. Aubrey or Megan, do you know, did we get that published as an FAQ? Does that ring a bell to you?
I'm not sure about an FAQ, but we certainly have a lot of information that we can provide through the AAQ. So that's what I would suggest.
Yeah.
I'll take a look and see if there's an FAQ, but if not, I will pull up some language hopefully before the end of this call.
Great.
Thank you. As we look for that, we do have a few specific questions about habitability and if it meets a sheltered situation. So we have one attendee who's asking if sheds/pallet shelters are considered emergency shelter or unsheltered locations. In this situation, they do have porta potties on site.
So again, I can't answer that universally because I have seen several communities using different modes, and the way they implement it makes a difference. So for instance, there is a community in California that has cabins. They have electricity, and they meet essentially the requirements of the basic habitability requirements. So again, you'd have to walk through those standards. Does your unit, your actual sleeping unit, provide that electricity? In the very least, it's got to have lighting that's driven by electricity, right? So you just got to go through those various requirements, whether it's pallet, tiny home, shed, those terms in and of themselves don't define it. It's the quality of or the other attributes of the facility that define whether or not it meets the requirements.
Thank you so much. We have a few
real quick, sorry, Tommy Joe. I did find 2 FAQs that speak to habitability a little bit, or at least kind of drawing the lines between uninhabitable spaces that should be counted as unsheltered versus those that might be considered sheltered. We do also answer AAQs about specific situations, though, too, if that's helpful.
Yeah, thanks for posting those. I couldn't remember if we published them, but I thought we had. So I would encourage folks to look at those FAQs.
Perfect. And it does look like we have our first hand raised. So Lisa Stewart, you are now unmuted to ask your question.
I'll just take a look at the guidance that you posted in those FAQs.
Oh.
I'm sorry, Lisa,
okay.
you were kind of breaking up there. Can you say that again?
I'm going to take a look at the guidance provided in those FAQs. It was just more questions on the habitability.
Great, perfect. Thank you so much. If you do have a follow-up question, or if anyone else has a question you'd like to ask verbally, please feel free to raise your hand by clicking that little raise hand feature you can see highlighted on your screen now. If you're on the phone, just hit *3. Again, that's *3 to raise your hand to ask a question verbally. We have a few follow-up questions on Ssbf EHA. I think these may start with Megan. One attendee is asking if the Ssbf provider in their community has agreed to enter in an emergency shelter project for their EHA dollars. Is that permissible and okay?
I think this is a question for William and the VA, actually. So we had decided for this year that we were, and this I think is related to a follow-up question, that we were not asking communities to enter these data into their HMIS under a separate project type. So this is something I think I'm going to kick back to William.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, if you have a provider willing to do that, absolutely. We're not going to stop you from doing that. I just don't want to require that of everyone because we know there are higher priorities than double entering data into a project, but there is value in doing it. So if you have that as a priority, you have the ability to do it, absolutely do it. It will have implications. Again, we will be able to likely include that in LSA and SBM easier because you'll have it as a project that's set up as emergency shelter and easily separatable. So yes, if you can do it. If you can't, again, look for the guidance we're going to provide to you.
I also want to clarify real quick, just for those of you who are following along in the chat, that question did not specify whether they were talking about HMIS or HDX, but both of the responses that William and Megan just gave assumed that they were talking about entering that data into HMIS, I believe.
Yeah, good clarification.
Wonderful. As we enter towards the end of our time, I do want to remind people if you have any remaining questions to please add them in the chat or to raise your hand or press *3 to be able to ask your question. We have another hotel-motel COVID isolation question. William, I think this will go to you. Where an attendee in their COC has reserved hotel rooms as COVID isolation and quarantine spaces for individuals experiencing homelessness. And it's a set-aside number of rooms at all times with the option to expand even further. But the rooms are only filled in consultation with their public health department as needed. Should these be reported on their head?
That's a great question. So honestly, I haven't gotten that question. So I'm going to be thinking out loud here. So my response is when you have those beds, but the only way to fill them due to your relationship with the public health department is to fill them through the isolation quarantine protocols you have, I would lean towards include them, but include them based on how they're filled that night. That would be a different way than we normally approach emergency shelter, and that would just be different than different mainly because of the nature of the beds. So that's when I'd encourage you to send an AAQ if you have that specific question for your community, because I want to noodle over that a little bit more. Again, that's a little different than we normally do for shelter. We generally say all shelter units are required for to be reported on the HIC and all people associated with them. So again, there's no doubt that if you have some people in them, are you going to report them, and are you going to report them as sheltered on the sheltered pit? Yes, absolutely. I think I lean towards just doing it based on the number that are there because of the nature of how they can access the beds. So great question. Aubrey, do you have more to add there? I know you looked at these a lot as well.
I do not.
Okay, great.
Perfect. So we are checking for any final questions. Again, if anyone would like to ask a question verbally, click that little raise hand feature or hit *3 on your phone. William, we have a question that just came in, and actually this might be thrown open, but an attendee who's saying the number of rapid rehousing beds reported in the HIC has been a highly valued data point in the annual NOFA, and since there might be this is a one-night glance at rapid utilization, it's limited in communicating their rapid assistance throughout the year. Do you know if any future NOFAs will devalue the amount of NOFA points given to rapid rehousing beds reported on the HIC?
So the short answer is I can't answer that question. I am prohibited from saying anything about a future NOFA. However, I will tell you we have looked at this. We already know that the rapid rehousing data, it is important. We value getting rapid rehousing data. However, the HIC is an imperfect vehicle. It's the better vehicle to date, although now that we have LSA data and other sources, we certainly will look at what we can glean from there. But I can't commit to what we will do in the NOFA. I'm actually not sure what's going to change with regard to the rapid rehousing scoring or what questions in the next NOFA or future NOFA. So you'll just have to stay tuned, but we are aware of the issue, of the historical issue, and how it may actually have been impacted by COVID as well.
Perfect. As we move to the end of our webinar, I do want to remind everyone that these materials will be posted. The recording, the slides, the chat, the Q&A will all be available on the Hub Exchange in about 2 to 3 days after we're able to make them accessible and get them posted. As we wrap up, William, do you have any final comments that you want to share with everyone?
Well, just thank you again for all your work. We really appreciate all that you do in the PID count and data collection world, but really in keeping people safe and doing all you can to help those who are experiencing homelessness and your own staff. Thank you.
Wonderful. With that, we will be closing out our webinar. As Aubrey, Megan, and William have said, if you have a question that was not answered or is very specific, please feel free to submit an AAQ via the HUD Exchange so that we can get you a specific answer to your question. And this is the final webinar in the series for the 2021 point in time count. So thank you all so much, and that concludes our webinar.